Iira Levin from Harvard and her team. So we need, can you stop sharing, please? Yes, thank you, Elaine. And Mira, are you with us? Let me spotlight your video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Manal, I need to introduce Meira. So,
On your side, it's your session now. So we have Professor Zavit Gross from Bar Ilan, and the floor is yours. This is your session. Go ahead.
Great.
Yeah.
So, dear Professor Meira Levинson, our keynote speaker, who is Professor of Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our special session entitled, "It is ever moral for teachers to be bystanders and not upstanders." My name is Professor Zavit Gross, and I'm the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair for Values Education, Tolerance, and Peace, and the head of the Salvan Gelder Center for Holocaust Research and Instruction in the School of Education, Bar-Ilan University. And I'm also a member of the Special Committee for Values Education in Hayozmat, the Israeli Science Foundation. In this session, we will first listen to Professor Meira Levинson address, and then we will split to 4 breakout rooms with facilitators from Meira Levinson's team at Harvard, where each group will be asked to analyze a case study which will help us to implement the theoretical conceptualizations that we will hear in her keynote address. It was my dream to initiate and collaborate with a special conference which will be dedicated to the topic of the bystanders. For many years, my main focus in research and practice has been peace education and Holocaust education, where the issue of the bystander is a major issue. In my eyes, while this has been analyzed in detail from a historical perspective, this important issue has been neglected within the field of education research. Besides my extensive research in the field for 25 years, I'm a facilitator of conflict resolution courses and academic and research encounters between Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, and Jewish students at Bar-Ilan University. Within this framework, I organize special educational study trips to conflict areas in Israel to meet with the local Arab and Jewish leadership. These visits have included Akko, Nazareth, Shfa'am, Jaffa, Abu Ghosh, and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Recently, I've established a special interfaith study group taking the Hebrew concept Bet Midrash, a house of study for shared learning experiences of imams and rabbis together with Arab and Jewish students to study together the canonical texts from Islam and Judaism. Through these various activities, I've become deeply aware of the issue of the bystander in current conflictual situations, which is still largely uncharted waters. The current pandemic has even intensified the need to highlight this aspect. Through online teaching via Zoom, teachers in schools and university professors are exposed to new challenges where our educational aspects are expanded into the private spheres of our students. These challenges are the scope of our perspective and responsibility and raises some significant ethical questions which we have not previously experienced, creating new challenges. I hope that in this session, we will have an opportunity to explore concepts relating to the bystander from a very special and unique theoretical approach. Today, we are privileged to hear our keynote speaker, Professor Meira Levинson from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. Now I will tell you about her official bio. Professor Levинson is not only a key researcher with an international reputation through her publications, but she also has many years of practical experience in teaching and learning with free service students. She invests a lot of practical effort into training teachers and influencing policymakers in the United States because she believes that they will make the difference. And now, as I said, let me say something official. Meira Lewinson is Professor of Education in Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her areas of research include civic education, racial justice, and educational ethics. She is currently working to start a global field of educational ethics modeled after bioethics that is philosophically rigorous, disciplinarily, and experientially inclusive, and both relevant to and informed by educational policy and practice. Meira serves on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission's Committee on Safe Work, Safe School, and Safe Travel. She has also written white papers on educational ethics during a pandemic and schools during the COVID-19 pandemic, sites and sources of community resilience, and been lead author for a New England Journal of Medicine article on reopening primary schools during the pandemic. She is currently conducting an international research and professional development initiative with educators in 10 countries on the ethical issues they face under COVID. Meira has written or co-edited 6 books, including Democratic Discord in Schools, Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, and No Citizen Left Behind. She shares educational ethics resources on justiceschools.org, rich video materials to support higher education pedagogy at Instruction Moves, and resources for youth activities and teacher allies at youthinfront.org. Each of these projects reflects Meira's commitment to achieving productive cross-fertilization without loss of rigor among scholarship, policy, and practice. Meira earned a BA in philosophy at Yale and a PhD in political theory at Nuffield College, Oxford University. She also taught middle school for 8 years in public schools in the US. Her keynote address is entitled, "Is it ever moral for teachers to be bystanders, not upstanders?" Professor Meira Lewinson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zahavit. That was very kind. Yes, as Zahavit said, first of all, let me say how honored and excited I am to be here at this and to be joined by 3 colleagues whom you will meet in about 20 minutes. Daniela Forster, who teaches at the University of Newcastle in Australia, Gary Mitchell, who is a doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a former teacher, and Alicia Banerjee, who is also a doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and serves on the Harvard Educational Review Board. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you guys. What I'm going to do is talk for, I'll try to make it a little less than 20 minutes. And then, as Zahavit mentioned, we're going to have a short case discussion, and then we're going to come back and have a sort of a whole group sort of Q&A. So just what I'm going to do this right now is talk about 3 dilemmas of education, of educators as bystanders, and then using those dilemmas somewhat as framing, we'll go into the case discussion, and then we'll come back and think about what we've learned about the ethics of bystanding from the case, and also what we've learned about the use of case studies, of normative case studies, for enabling complex conversations about these issues. But let me start. I was interested to hear Zahavit say that she feels as if bystanders have been relatively neglected in education, because that's actually not true, I would say, in the United States. In the United States, there is a lot of at least imagery and language to students about the importance of not being a bystander and instead being an upstander. So, these were just sort of random images that I was able to take off of the web in about 5 seconds because there are just so many of them, where teachers, as part of an anti-bullying initiative, particularly over the last 15 years or so, have really been taught to teach their students why it's important not to be a bystander when they see other children being bullied or excluded in any way, and why it's really important therefore to be an upstander, to stand up for the victim and to stand against, say, the bully and say, no, 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 that's not how we do things around here. And so what you can see is not only is there a lot of imagery here in favor of being an upstander, somebody who stands up against injustice or stands up against bullying, but there's actually also a critique of being a bystander, right? So you see the bystander is described as being harmful, that the upstander who takes positive action is the opposite of a bystander, right? You see bystander crossed out. So this is the traditional view that teachers have been taught, at least in the United States, to teach students. And hence we think, therefore, we're taught ourselves, right, that we should ourselves never be bystanders. That if we see something wrong, we should be upstanders as well, and we should speak out. What I want to do over the next 12 minutes or so is put that into question a bit. I'm actually all in favor of upstanding. This is not a paper or a talk that is critiquing upstanding, but I do think that the ethics of being a bystander are much more complicated than we see with like this black heart, harmful bystander, and the idea that bystanding is itself intrinsically wrong. And so to talk about that, I'm going to sort of think about 3 dilemmas, all right? So the first dilemma comes from a case that we actually have in our book, Democratic Discord in Schools, and also is freely available on the website that Zahavit mentioned, justiceinschools.org. And Gary, I don't know if you have access to the chat. I think it's disabled, but if it's not, if you don't mind just like sticking the web address into the chat, that would be great. Thanks. So this is a case that is fictionalized, but based on an incident that happened in a real school a few years ago, where this was an elementary school, a primary school, and there was a group of children in first grade. They were 6 years old, 3 boys who were building a wall out of blocks during...
כמו שאתם יכולים לראות, והם בעצם, ואז הם בנו את הקיר הזה, ואז המורה שלהם שאל את הילדים, מה אתם עושים? ואז הילדים אמרו, שבנו את הקיר, אמרו, בעצם אנחנו בונים קיר כדי שהמקסיקנים לא ייכנסו, אנחנו בונים קיר נגד מקסיקנים, אז זה היה בתקופת נשיאותו של דונלד טראמפ. אז באותה נקודה המורה בעצם שהיא לא הייתה ממש מעריצה גדולה של בניית קיר נגד המקסיקנים, כאילו...
So her first possibility is that she redirects them. And she says, wow, that's quite an impressive wall that you've built. Let's move on to the paints, right? And redirects them from this disturbing activity that she's feels, demonstrates not the right ethical approach and not the right approach to doing community. Her second approach is not necessarily to redirect the boys, but quite publicly and enthusiastically and invitingly to model more inclusive behavior. Anna, the boys are making their wall, but let's play family and pretend that we're making tortillas with your abuela, with your grandmother in Spanish, right? And make that seem really appealing and to model an attitude of inclusivity and community. The third is directly to confront. and to say to the boys something like, well, how do you think that your wall makes Anna feel? Or in the case that we have, she actually starts asking, that's really interesting, why do you think we sometimes try to keep people out? And the kids have a conversation about that. And one of the kids says, well, because they'll take our jobs. And so then she continues the conversation, says, well, what's your job? It's to be kind and to be nice and to be caring and to learn. Can anybody take that away from you? And the kids are like, no. And she's like, great, then nobody can take your job. All right. So in my read of, as we think about bystanders versus upstanders, confronting is the one upstanding choice. But I'm not positive that confronting is actually the right choice. It might be the right choice on occasion, excuse me, but I don't think it's the right choice in every case. And I think that part of what we want to think about is, when is it that we want the direct upstanding of confrontation? When is that appropriate? And when are there actually other ways in which you might want to respond to a behavior that you think is concerning and even wrong, either through redirection or potentially through modeling, right? So that's very, very briefly dilemma number one. Dilemma number two is a different case that I write about in an article that I published on teaching and moral injury, the experience of moral injury for teachers who have to decide how to behave justly when there is no just action that they can take, but they also need to act. And this focuses also on a case that arose in a school. In this case, it's a high school. So with a kid, we'll call him one, who applied to this high school. It's a private, actually Catholic high school that is designed for children coming from very low income families, usually whose parents have not gone on to college. So it's sort of designed to take kids who are often neglected in a traditional system and to help them gain the skills to go on to college, et cetera. Juan had applied to the school at the encouragement of his aunt, who had, with whom he was living along with his father after his mom died. And Juan wanted to do well in school, had not been doing well the last few years. His father has anger management issues that had caused some issues. His mother had died. And they were pretty upfront about the fact that he had had some drug issues in middle school, basically smoking marijuana. So they're aware of this. They can see that he's smart, that he's motivated, that his aunt is really, pushing him. They take him. He, about in October of that first year, comes to school with a full backpack that is just really reeking of marijuana, right? Like he's sitting in science class and you can just smell it. And so, and the kids are starting to talk. The science teacher takes him out of the room and says, Juan, can you tell me what's going on? He opens up his backpack and there is like a kilogram bag of marijuana. And like, what are you doing? Said, well, we were just going to go smoke on the hill after school. I'm not selling it, whatever, basically, I realized I shouldn't have this, but like, I wasn't going to do anything with it. And then the school has to figure out what to do next. And they have a quite strong anti-drug policy. Their policy would be to expel him. That they try to keep it very strict. And it was a lot of marijuana, and all the kids know because, right, the science room is now smelling of marijuana, right? So in this case, again, I think the school is in a really, really hard position, right? They knew that he had been smoking marijuana in middle school. That was not hidden from them. They had accepted him anyway, in part because they think of themselves as a school that serves students who have lots of needs, but also lots of promise. So one possibility is that they say, all right, well, we're going to engage with Juan. We'll keep him in the school, even though he broke our rules. And even though now every other kid in the school knows that he broke our rules and got away with it, because that's what it means to stand up for a kid like Juan. And we had accepted him and we'd taken him. I think that's probably the upstander approach. But it has some challenges to it because this is a school that does not want to get a reputation as a drug school, right? And they need to show some equity in how they treat different kids, et cetera. A second possibility is they do try to sweep it under the rug. So he actually has a probation officer. He had been involved. He had stolen some stuff out of a car earlier, and his probation officer had said that he was actually going to pull Juan from the school and send him to a much, much worse school if he got in trouble again. So they could just evade, not report, not say anything, not stand up to the probation officer, but also like hope that it somehow magically goes away. However, I think a third option that many, many schools take when they are faced with these really bad first two options that they don't know how to basically keep the rules going is to exit preemptively, is to say, okay, given that we've had experiences like this, we're hearing Juan tell us as he's applying for admission that he's, that he's been drug involved. And we don't want to have this problem, right? And so therefore, we won't admit him in the first place. In a way, this option takes a school out of risking being a bystander. And that's sort of the second dilemma that I want us to think about is we are bystanders when we are in a place where we can see injustice or wrong going on. And that's when we're often forced to grapple with the question of should we be, how do we be an upstander? Is it okay, if ever, to be a bystander? Oftentimes, I think that the way schools and even teachers avoid being in that position of being a bystander is not to be in that space in the first place. And the way we avoid being in that space is that we avoid letting people in who will put us in that space. And so one of the risks, I think, as we think about what does it mean to bystand versus upstand, and is it ever okay to be a bystander, is that we will say, we will not take in children like Juan, who will then put us in this position. And instead, we will pretend they don't exist, and then we won't actually have to be bystanders in the first place. And I think that's probably a bad thing to do, right? We probably want to encourage schools to take kids like Juan, but then we do struggle with this question of that now we are complicit in events where we may be bystanders versus upstanders. The third dilemma is the one that has come up, Zahavi mentioned briefly, and that's come up a lot during COVID, right? Which is that as schools went online and stopped meeting in person, and as children had to take on many, many more obligations for their families, because their families lost employment, because housing became less secure, because they lost access to free meals through the schools and had to work for that reason, that kids started contacting teachers for help in all sorts of ways at all sorts of times, right? And that as teachers were hosting kids on Zoom, those students were able to see into the teachers' classrooms, which was their homes, and teachers were then torn as to how much do I need to do to help my students, and how long do I need to be available to help my students? So this is the question so Daniela and Alicia and I have been working together on this project about how educators have been facing ethical challenges under COVID. And we've heard this a lot in the discussion groups we led, that teachers have been asking, when is it okay to turn off, to shut down, to stop planning? Because it's been so hard to plan for good teaching when it's all remote, to leave a student's text or an email unanswered. And we've been hearing, you know, that teachers feel so overwhelmed by how to plan to teach over Zoom remotely, how to contact kids who have not been present or whose cameras are off all the time, what to do when a child who has, say, taken on a job at a grocery store to help their family then starts texting them at 10 or 11 or midnight to ask for help, what to do when they are really worried about a kid who they think is, you know, falling off the map. How much should they be doing? And how we've heard really moving testimonies from teachers about how they feel as if they've been prioritizing their students over even their own children, and what it feels like to be like sitting in one room trying to teach their Zoom class as they hear their 3-year-old, you know, yelling in the room next door, and what kind of balance to set there. I think this is another dilemma around bystanding, because the question is, what limits do you set for yourself on how much you need to stand up for your students versus when you are willing to stand by and watch potential failure because it's just too much, right? And teachers have always wrestled with this question. So for years, we've done interviews and other things, and this has been a constant, is teachers feeling always that they should do more, right? But therefore, I think this is really a classic thing that we need to wrestle with, including in teacher education and teacher norms. When is it okay for a teacher to stand by and say, I know it's not enough for you, but this is as much as I can do or give right now, and that's okay. And so that feels like a third dilemma around bystanding. So with those three very brief kinds of dilemmas, where I think that it's really what I'm trying to do is question the idea that there's this hard and fast line between the good of upstanding and the evil of bystanding. What I want to do very briefly is talk about sort of the method, and then send you into breakout rooms to talk about a case. So what I have tried to do very briefly is sketch out some realistic accounts of really complex ethical dilemmas that arise in schools or with teachers in classrooms, where somebody needs to make a decision among courses of action, but there isn't actually one self-evidently right action to take. I think in the case of the kids building the wall, in the case of whether or not to admit one to your school and what to do once he has really openly broken the rules, and in the case of having students with too many needs and teachers with so many pressures at home and not being sure how to balance those. These are all cases in which it's not self-evident what the right thing to do is. And to say to a teacher, well, you need to be an upstander rather than a bystander, doesn't offer them clear guidance. And I think it's often more helpful for us to talk about these really concrete cases rather than talk about either really idealized cases like the trolley problem, which is the little drawing with the red slash through at the top, where we try to take out all of the details, because when we take out all the details, often the decisions are way too easy. It's when you have those details in, which is the way we live our real lives, that's when I think these questions become harder. And that's where we should be spending our time talking and helping teachers spend their time talking. And it's also different from the, you find a wallet on the ground, what do you do with it kind of question, because then there's clear answer. Right? But we live our lives as educators and as educational leaders and as educational policymakers in this really nebulous gray world. And that's the world that I try to help people be able to have conversations about. And so we write these cases to focus on dilemmas, which I'll define as the decision in which one must choose among a set of options, none of which is self-evidently the right one to choose. I'm actually going to skip the sort of phronesis part. Just for time reasons, because I want to make sure that you guys have time to talk about the case. So what we're going to do now is Zehavit very kindly wrote up for me an account of a case that arose in Israel. She wrote it up beautifully, and then I just, for the purposes of this discussion, totally rewrote it to fictionalize it and to try to make it shorter. So we're going to go into, you're going to be
let me explain that, Mira, please. This is Manal. How are you? Thank you.
Sure, fine, thanks.
Yeah, so let me explain how this goes. So I'll let you explain, but this is really very important because what we're going to do 3 breakout rooms. You're going to stay in the main breakout rooms. The moment I open, the rooms are all set. The moment I open them, you will automatically, all of you will get an invitation. So Meira, Zahavit, don't accept the invitation and stay in the main room. So I would like also all the co-hosts, most of the co-hosts, like some of them should go to the rooms and some stay. So for those who would like to stay with Meira, because the way it's set here, I think we'll have about 25 in each group, in each room. So we'll have like an even number. I'm sure some people will, but again, it's random except for the main room. So you can, and then in each room, in room number 1, I have Gary Mitchell. In room number 2, I have Daniela Forster as the moderator. And in the room number 3, we have Alicia. They're all set in the rooms and the people will join them automatically.
Great, thanks, Manal. So when you get there, Daniela and Gary and Alicia will introduce themselves and give you a little framing, and then they will put a link to the case. We have the case both in English and in Hebrew. I'm afraid that I got it to Zahavi too late to get it translated into Arabic, and that is my fault, not hers, and I apologize for that. But you will have a few minutes to read the case, and then you'll have a collective discussion about it, partly through writing and partly through talking. And then we'll come back together in about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to have Q&A and discussion. Okay?
Okay, but they will have, like they have 25, we're going to come back to main room at 3:45. I will send 5 minutes before they are done. I'll just send a message telling them that we'll have 5 minutes, and then 2 minutes, I'll just tell them that they have 2 minutes to wrap up and finish. And then we'll come to the main room, and whoever wants to ask questions, please write in the chat box so we can relate to the question in the last 15 minutes. Also, Mira can relate to the questions, okay? So should I start? Okay,
sure.
I'm going to, okay, so go ahead. Good luck, everyone. As I said, I would like some of the participants to who would like to stay with Meira in the main room, and for the others to accept the invitation. I see that not a lot of people has accepted the invitation. Some are still outside. So let me just see how the situation goes. And according to this, I can move in and out some of the participants.
Looks like Tamara is not getting the invitation.
What you can do if you don't see anyone who would, if you don't see the invitation, what you can do, click on in the bottom where you see the shared the screen, the green bottom shared screen on the right side. Either you have 3 dots or you can see it there. Just look for breakout rooms. Once you click in breakout rooms, it will take you to the room that you were assigned to. So let's see, I have people who joined me after I set the room, so I'll just have to do it manually, or they will need to stay in the main room. Okay, so in the meantime, the 20 participants, yeah, they're in the main room, yeah, and the others I see now we have 24 in room number 1, We have 26 in numbers, and in number 3 with Alicia, we have 23. Okay, so and I really I suggest that my co-host Wafa, Ilan, Mickey, you can enter one of the 3 rooms in case they need anything there.
And it looks like I can also help assign people.
Yeah.
You want to wave at me I can assign you somewhere.
I think we're all set now. We have now here in the main room. Let's see, unless they want to go, I'll try to do.
So am I leading the discussion in this main room?
Yeah. You can. Yeah. Just you can start. You can start. This is
Okay. Now I understand. Okay.
You and Zahabit are in the main room, and the other
okay. Now
they're already there. Some of them are already there. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Now I understand. All right. So let me then. Very sorry. I did not. Now I get it. All right. So what I'm going to do right now for time reasons is put the link in the chat here to the 2 versions of the case. They're the same. They're just translated. Do you guys see the case in the chat? Great. So if you will go ahead and click on the link for whichever one you want.
You can share the screen as well.
Yeah, I will in a minute. I'm just setting up my screen because I had been confused as to what was going on. Great. So yeah, so I'm just going to ask that as you read the case, ask yourself, what dilemmas do you see in the case, for whom and why? And how do these relate to the bystanders theme for today's conference? Okay. All right, I will give you, and then when you have finished reading the case, if you can just raise your hand with using the icon, and that way I'll know that people have gotten through it.
Meira, I didn't have time to thank you, so I will do it after the breakout.
Yeah.
I just wanted it to, also I wanted to introduce, the short bios of the facilitators, but I saw that.
That's right.
Yeah, great. You had an excellent presentation, Meira.
Oh, thank you.
You remember, Meira, when we first met in Harvard, I asked you about...
Actually, I'm going to stop you because I want to make sure people don't get distracted. I want to make sure they can keep on reading just for time. So I'm seeing a few hands to say that you have finished reading the case. I'm sorry to interrupt you quickly. I've put in the chat a link to a Jamboard, and I'm just going to share it quickly so that you see. If you go there and you go to the third slide in the Jamboard, then you will see the question, what dilemmas do you see in this case? And why are these dilemmas and for whom? And if you go to the, if you just look for a second, oh wait, is it showing? Yes, okay. There's a little picture of a sticky note there. If you click on the sticky note, then you can write, you know, a dilemma. So should Professor Avram report Fatima for suspected domestic abuse, say, and it will then post on the Jamboard and you can move it. Okay, does that make sense? So again, I'll let you now go back to finish reading the case, but then when you've finished, hopefully you can make it to the Jamboard and start posting some responses to this question.
If you want to talk, just open the mic again because there was like this background noise that I have to disable. Just click on the mute, unmute yourself. You're still mute.
מנל, אני חושבת שהמתרגם הסימולטני לערבית נמצא במליאה, וצריך לחלק אותו, להקצות אותו לחדר.
איך קוראים לו? כן, כן, איך קוראים?
אני חושבת שמופיע פה בתור טרנסליישנס, אם אני מנחשת נכון.
אני רואה אותך, כן, טרנסליישן, אוקיי.
אני חושבת שזה הוא, אבל אני לא בטוחה. אולי אפשר... איתמר, אתה יכול...
כן, זה ערבית, הטרנסליישן זה ערבית.
אז אפשר אולי להקצות אותו לאחד החדרים שירוויחו את התרגום.
כן, כן, אז אני עכשיו אעשה את זה.
תודה.
אבל הוא יכול לעשות את זה, הוא צריך להיות שם, הוא צריך אבל not join, הוא צריך ללחוץ על איפה breakout rooms, והוא צריך להיכנס אוטומטית, הוא לא נכנס.
את רוצה...
אני לא יכולה עכשיו להחליק אותו עוד פעם, כי הוא כבר שם.
אז כאילו, אוקיי.
אז אני אעשה לו, כאילו, אני אשנה את המקום שלו. Mira, sorry for the interruption, you can go on.
אני יכולה לשלוח לך את הטלפון שלו, אם את רוצה.
לא, אני אסדר, לא.
100%, אוקיי, תודה רבה לך, בהצלחה.
כן, ביי. Sorry, Mira.
Sorry, I'm sorry that it's not accessible.
It's the translation. It's not like the we're speaking about interpretation. Yeah.
Right. So I'm sensing that either the Jamboard is not accessible or it feels weird. So since we're a small enough group, I will, rather than sort of suggesting that you put the stickies on, since I'm not seeing anything get added, let me just open it up. Have you guys had a chance to finish reading the case at this point? There's a thumbs up from Gabriela.
I think Meira, you can go ahead.
Okay, all right. So let me just ask then, feel free to raise your hand or just to unmute and to share. What dilemmas do you see arising in this case? And why and for whom? Gabriela, go for it.
Yeah, well, I definitely see as a dilemma for the instructor. What are they supposed to do now? There's lots of different, should they try to contact Fatima to find out what is going on? Should they address the issue in class? Other students have become very upset about it. Is it something that they sort of let fall under the table, or do they bring it into class and into the discussion?
Great, thanks, Gabriela. Right, so yes, this set of questions around how overt, explicit, and active, yes, the professor should be with regard to Fatima. There are some other dilemmas I see. Miri, are you unmuted intentionally to offer one? Or Amira?
All of them can talk. There's
Okay.
yeah. Whoever wants to step in.
Yeah, can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think that even though I haven't been teaching since COVID, but I think that as soon as the home and the teaching became one, both for the teacher and the student, it was an obligation and an opportunity to find out more about the home. Here it seems like the professor and the other students are finding out about the home by surprise, which is probably what happens mostly. Your cat walks by, your children walk by, the man in the house, whom it's not clear who it is, walks by. And I don't think anybody, I mean, one suggestion had been to talk to people about that beforehand, what background or what area they were exposing when Zoom started. But on the other hand, when we teach in the classroom, we sometimes get away with not knowing anything about the students. And then maybe there's a way, as I'm talking as a faculty member, as faculty, that we can help them. So I thought I wrote in the sticky, the first question is, what's the proper venue for continuing this discussion? You know, do you have to shut it off and talk privately, call after class? Both, these are older students, same, call the, what is her name, Fatima, after class, teacher, call her after class. For me, it's more of a question of the ways to address the dilemma. Or that, well, I guess that's the dilemma, if to address it at all, but you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I was a high school principal and I know all the other three. Your first three dilemmas were my dilemmas. This one is very
familiar. You're right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Beverly. Other thoughts?
I think for the other students, definitely had a dilemma. And if I was putting myself in their perspective, if I had a colleague of mine writing something like that, I would also not know what's the right way to go about this. Is this something personal that accidentally came out? And so it's not something that actually I was informed. It was not a friend telling me about this. So what is my responsibility towards Fatima as a friend or as a colleague?
Yeah, that feels really important to me, that we often position the teacher as being the one who has this decision to make. But in this case, I guess what I started with the idea that, often we're trying to teach students not to be bystanders, to be upstanders. But there is this question now, like, what does that mean in this case?
They're going to look to the teacher to also tell them what their role is. They want to.
Right. Yes, which is complicated. I'm curious how much issues of the teacher's identity and or the student's identities play a role for you in thinking about these dilemmas.
As there are big cultural issues here that different cultures see differently, and the dilemma sort of made it sound like Fatima looks uncomfortable, so that already puts a negative on it. But sometimes we have, one culture sees it one way, and who am I to judge that other culture? And we want to have shitufiyut. We want, certainly on the college level, for people from different backgrounds to study together. But we have to be very careful when we express an opinion, especially publicly, to that person. That's why I'm always in favor of first speaking privately.
Thanks, Beverly. Yeah, so in this respect, sorry, was somebody about to speak? No. Okay. So in this respect, I'm curious, as we think about the issues of bystanding and the questions that I had raised about, like, when it might actually even be appropriate to be a bystander as opposed to an upstander. I'm curious about the risks that you see. In fact, one of the reasons I find this case really hard is because of the risks that I see in actually upstanding sort of too quickly. And I'm curious, about your thoughts about that. We've heard from Gabriella about the potential for there to be multiple bystanders in this case, right? The professor and the students. We haven't really talked about the Jewish students versus the Arab students in the class. Obviously, Professor Avram herself is Jewish. We know that she had Shabbat dinner with her husband. Lama, were you about to say something? I'd seen an unmute, but it may have been accidental.
They can raise their hand if anyone would like to say something. Just you can see participants, or they can just step in.
Yep.
Can I say?
Yes.
I just think that maybe it's less of a dilemma for the students, because I don't think that all the students can get involved or should be writing on chat or should be discussing it. Maybe, this is one case where one can disable chat and say, I see there have been concerns, and, the teacher, I think it's over to the teacher. Like, if it was in school or in class, you wouldn't want students discussing one student behind their back or with their knowledge. So I would not let the students be bystanders. I would say, look, I see what's happened here, and I'll deal with it. And anybody who wants to can contact me, privately or something like that.
That's so interesting that you describe that as not letting them be bystanders. In ways, it feels like one interpretation of that is that you sort of require them to be bystanders.
Because not to be a bystander, but I would take them out of that dilemma. I would say, this is not your, I don't want everybody just, it's not, they can't all contact her. They're not all going to call, it's not.
Yeah.
I'd take them out of it. I would say, this is not your responsibility. I will take responsibility, or I will, think about it. And if.
Other thoughts? Thanks, Sarah.
It definitely seems like the cultural issues of maybe being afraid of acting out of cultural misunderstandings that might make it even more difficult to know what am I interpreting something in this? Is what was the discussion by the students as well? Just because now it's of another culture, I'm assuming that there's something going on here that might just be a normal situation that I just caught up on, you know, an angry father is something everyone's experience and not something necessarily that is that detrimental. So I think the cultural issue makes it even more of a dilemma of treading territory that you might take misstep that you're not aware of.
Other thoughts in this regard, where either, yes, it's the cultural differences and the chances of cultural misinterpretation feel so great that you would not necessarily take action, or alternatively, where you feel it's very clear that you should take action and what action you should take. In fact, for time reasons, I'm interested. Does anybody here think absolutely you need to intervene? I mean, let's say you reach out to Fatima, or the Professor Avram reaches out to Fatima, and she continues to say, no, everything's fine, right? You know, would any of you take an extra step beyond that?
Depends how you reached out to her in the first place.
Can you say more?
If it was just, you know, are you okay? She said yes, you know, yes, you know, that's not a serious reaching out. And if it was, you know, make up a reason to drag her in and meet face to face or meet in a safe environment, that's a bit different, and then you can try and have a real conversation. But it is her, you know, if somebody doesn't want to share with you, then they don't. It could take time as well. We had students who have problems, and, you know, first month they say no, there's no problem, and only after 2 months do they actually come and, you know, we can deal with something. So it has to be confidence in the teacher as well. I mean, why would you tell the teacher if there was a problem?
Right. Well, that's part of the challenge that we often face as teachers, right? Is that we can't actually, that we often are unsure that our students will tell us when they need help. And there is some feeling, right, on our part as educators that we need to sort of go the extra mile that our students may not even be ready to ask us for.
Well, it seems so difficult to overstep. When do you overstep your boundaries, and when are you upstanding? It's really, I think, extremely difficult in situations like that. And then one always hears again, me too, that why wasn't there someone listening? Why didn't teachers be aware of grooming, for example? Why weren't others aware of these things? But often they're not clear cut, and you don't know when you would, you know, situations like molestation, sexual abuse, and you don't know if the child has. What is the point where you step in and or you just have certain? I think it'd be very difficult. One would have to know more.
Mira, I'm calling them back in 1 minute. I sent them a message because it's 3:45. Is that okay?
All right, that's fine. I'm curious, since most of you stayed quiet during this discussion, if you're willing, I would be fascinated to find out what you think each of you should be done by whom. I mean, I think there are interesting questions about, say, you know, if, say, some of the Arab students are concerned about racism by their peers, their Jewish peers, or even by their professor, you know, should they actually kind of upstand to Professor Avram or to their colleagues and say, you know, let's talk more about why you know, took it as perfectly natural that the kids were screaming in the background, you know. So anyway, if you are willing to go to the Jamboard and add a sticky to say what you think should be done by anybody.
Can I say something, Mira?
Yes, Manal,
As an Arab, I don't see any Arab here interviewing, so I'm just really put it from my point of view. I think there are a lot of like misconceptions when we talk about.
Oops, you just muted yourself, Manal.
Sorry, yeah. Just choosing a name like Fatima, you know, also like the name is like so typical, like, you know, choosing, you know, a Muslim name and with the head cover and all these misconceptions that we have. Okay, we assume that there's violence in the background or children, I don't know. So I hate to generalize. I would take each case as it is and not make any judgment until I know all the information, all the circumstances. So even writing it vaguely, I think it doesn't do justice even to the reader who reads it. I think there are a lot of unclear information, missing information. So I cannot judge when I have such a case, either from, you know, reading about Fatma, it brings to my mind a lot of, you know, cases, but I wouldn't take it as the general and generalize it. This is my really stipulation.
Great, thank you, Manal. That actually sent us perfectly into the discussion I was hoping that we would have, because in part, yeah, one of the places I was hoping we would get to talking about is the fact that this case itself is being told from the perspective, right, is being related from the perspective of a Jewish professor, right? And that is part of the challenge, I think, as we think about these cases, that I think is really, really important, that a case sets up certain problems through how it's written, and part of the challenge then is how do you write, and should you write in a way that is sort of monoperspectival, right, from this perspective, say, of this professor, where what we get is what's going on in her head, right, but we don't get what's going on in other people's heads, or how, say, if you had, you know, an Arab professor, how they would see the exact same situation, right? And when is that an authentic representation, right? So in some ways it may be very helpful, let's say for Jewish, you know, teachers who see the case in this way, to be able to talk about that, and it may be very unproductive, right, for others. And or it may be that one would want to flip it and try to present the case from a different perspective. This is one of the things that we do when we write the cases, actually, and I was very curious to see how this was going to happen with this case. Normally, when we write the cases, we field test them with multiple groups, and we then do a lot of edits in order to make sure that they feel authentic and appropriate to people from a variety of positions. Very intentionally, I took this case that Zahavit had provided, and I tried to broaden the perspective slightly by including the kind of the chat conversation, you know, among the students near the end. But I did not try to flip or, you know, expand the perspectives. And I was curious what, you know, would happen as we had this conversation. And one possibility is that what we saw was a fairly small number of people sort of feeling comfortable, at least in my group, and being willing to talk about the case, perhaps because it felt alien or wrong, right, to other members of our group. And so this is one of the things I think can be both a challenge but also revealing in doing this kind of casework, is thinking about how we write and present cases that invite people into the conversation versus set up sort of exclusionary barriers. And so, in fact, there is a longer version of the case that Zahavit and I agreed we needed to cut down a lot so we would have time for you guys to read it and still have a conversation about it. I think the longer version does a somewhat better job of giving more details, but then at the cost of our, you know, of our being able to use it and offering more perspectives.
Meira, I just want to add one thing to Manal. It's very important. It is based on a real story, not a fiction, something that happened truly in one of the classrooms. Yet, because Meira changed it, we don't have all the information about it. But you should know that it's a real story and it's a real case. And I think that if we would have time, you know, to elaborate and see the whole situation, you would get some more information and more insight into this specific thing, and you would see that it's not something which is based on prejudice, you know, Fatma, etc. By the way, the name of the student was different, more modern. Fatma is really an old-fashioned name. I agree with Manal from this point of view, yet it is a real story.
No, it's not an old-fashioned. It's like it's, you know, like it's stereotypical. You know, it's just, you know, when you choose the name, you see, you know, Muhammad and Fatima.
You are absolutely right. Absolutely.
I think we are all now here, and I think this is here. As if you want to open it for questions for the participants after they finish. Yeah. We have. You have eight minutes.
Okay. Yes. So feel free to raise your hand or to type a question in the chat. Yes. Sorry, Roberto, I think. Something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Meira. And my question is very complex. So let me try to make it very easy. We as educators have values and we know what is right? But sometimes when we make an action, we have this, we need to pay a price, you know, to do the right thing. And I really want to ask you, how can we make a clear table of what is right and what I should do? I mean, it's so difficult. Also in our group was so difficult to have an answer.
Yeah. So thank you, Moshe. I mean, I think this is the thing that I actually am trying to help us do as educators, is have conversations that allow us to admit uncertainty and that enable us to have to admit that we may have some very clear values and principles that we want to uphold, but in specific cases, often we can't actually realize all of those values or principles simultaneously. And I think that's when things get hard, right? And I think that is much more common in education than we're willing to admit. In the United States, at least, over the last 20 years or so, educators have gotten pretty good at asking for help and having complex conversations about pedagogy, about classroom management, about questions of educational leadership. And so we can say, I really can't figure out how you teach children to divide fractions. It's just not working for me. Can you show me? Can you help me? Or I'm really having trouble figuring out how to help my novice teachers develop their skills, because they're in their own classrooms all day or whatever. What we don't have the opportunity to do so much is to say, I really need help figuring out how I realize my moral and ethical obligations toward my students, towards my staff, towards myself and my family. It doesn't feel as if I can do all of that at once, and I need help, right? We don't tend to be able to talk about that. That's shameful. It suggests that we're doing things that are wrong, right? And that's what I've been trying to do sort of through these cases and also so through trying to create this field of educational ethics is to make it possible for us to have those conversations. Let me just move on, to the question about what is how one would model the attitude of inclusivity and community in the case of the teacher and Fatima. So I think that so I see this case as being a really interesting one because although, say, Manal, you said, well, we don't know enough, right? We can't generalize from this case. And my thought is, right, exactly. In fact, when we're facing individual cases in our work as educators, we can never thoroughly generalize. And it's always the case that we don't know enough. Right. So in our group conversation, somebody said, well, you know, you would want to know more, right? You would want to be able to have a real conversation and ask her more information, perhaps ask other students more information, et cetera. But always we know less than we might, and particularly when we have not just one student we're thinking about, but 25 or 50 or 110. And so part of what we try to do with these cases is to make them very particular, because that's when things get hard. And to have but I don't know this, not be a fault of the case, but to be part of the conversation, right? So also, therefore, I think this question of whose perspective this case is written from is really important, because in some ways, although we tried to add in some alternative perspectives, near the end, including the idea that the professor herself and probably many of the students are actually seeing Fatima in this very stereotypical and very stereotyping way, that is the condition under which many teachers are teaching, right? So then part of the question, I think that it gets brought up much more in the longer case than in this one, is the question of how much as a teacher am I obliged to question my own biases, right? And how far do I go with that? And how much does, say, my being afraid about my own biases perhaps prevent me from then taking action if I'm worried about a student, right? And in the United States, we see this a lot, say, as we have mostly white teachers who are teaching a majority non-white student body now. And there's huge questions about sort of cultural assumptions that get made about white adults over-policing students of color, which you do not want. And at the same time, there's this risk, this gets back to the bystanding question, that if teachers are too afraid to intervene, and they say, I don't know, then they actually aren't standing up for children who need help. And so that is what feels to me as if it's actually a fairly universal question about how we as teachers challenge our own preconceptions about students who come from different families, from culturally different families, racially different families, religiously different families, et cetera. And when we decide that we know enough to act, and when we decide that we know enough to know that we shouldn't act, right? And I think that's a hard trade-off. All right, sorry, we have 1 minute left. So there's a question about sort of methodology and about relativism. I am not trying to argue in favor of relativism. When I am saying that these are hard questions, I'm not saying that anything goes or it's all relative or there's no, like, any answer that any person believes is equally right. What I'm saying is actually, as we try to grapple with, say, moral truth, that truth is itself complicated. And that's where we should be sort of talking. And so in that respect, I think the methodology, including with students, is we have a bunch of cases on our website and in our books, none of them, the rest of them translated into Hebrew or Arabic, I'm afraid, which are designed to help students have these kinds of conversations with each other to get actually better at talking about, well, what does like equality really mean here? Or what does justice really mean here? Or what does it really mean to be an upstander in this case? And that, I think, is where the power comes. Like, I don't know what it means actually to be an upstander in this case that we gave you. It may be that it means saying, I don't know enough, right? And to listen more. Or it may be to intervene. Okay, I know it's 10:01, so I should stop. Or sorry, 4:01 or 5:01.
Yeah. Thank you, Mira, and thank you, Daniela, Gary, and Alicia, and of course, Zahavit. That was a very rich and interesting session. Now we're going to have a break, an active break. And the next session will start at 4:15. We're going to have a live performance from Habama Theater with Yardena Hakmi. So it's called Every Day. I hoped that someone will see me and call me. I'm just translating to Hebrew. Okay, so thank you everyone, and stay with us.
Thank you very much, Meira, for your excellent and groundbreaking and thought-provoking address and discussion. I think that you've managed in a short time to expose us to the main aspect of this topic of bystander, which will serve as signposts while we analyze this key issue from a practical point of view. I think that your scholarship and leadership are very meaningful and provide inspiration for our theoretical and practical endeavors. Your concepts will provide us with the guidance and deeper understanding of these important issues. I hope we will be able to continue this collaboration also in the future, as the multicultural and multi-faith structure of the Israeli society can serve as a special case study within the general international research arena, where many countries are facing the same challenges of racism and discrimination. This is a great moment to say Chag Sameach to everyone. Thank you very much for your team, Dr. Daniela Foster, Alicia Benjari, and Gary Mitchell. I think we had an outstanding session, which will provide us with both practical guidance and food for thought as we move forward. I wish you all happy Passover and Shalom.
Shalom. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. It was great.